Okay, hello chess players. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Ruy Lopez being after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 begins the Ruy Lopez. And of course, we're going to be taking a look at the classical variation today, which is the move bishop to c5. And if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So one of the difficulties I'm going to have in doing this video is that there's not a whole lot of independent lines within the classical variation. And I got a lot of feedback on a video I did a while back on the Bush-Gas Gambit, and when I did my video on the Bush-Gas Gambit, I only covered the lines that I felt were completely independent of other openings. So, completely independent of the Stafford Gambit, for example. So, because of that, I got a lot of feedback saying that, well, you're covering moves that nobody really plays with the black pieces, and that this video, it's not very useful for me. And a lot of people had a point. So, what I'm going to be doing with this video is I am going to be pointing out all of the transpositions, but I'm also going to be covering, the lines within the transpositions as well, because quite frankly, this opening with bishop c5, it's basically just a whole bunch of transpositions. You're going to get into another opening when you're playing against this particular move order. For example, the main move here with white is just castles kingside, and the main move here with black is knight to f6. This is what everybody plays in this position. And of course, you can achieve this position out of a Berlin. You can achieve this position from the Berlin move order with knight f6 castles and then bishop c5. You can achieve the exact same position. And you can also run into this difficulty of, let's say they play bishop c5 and you castle. They could, of course, play knight to d4 here. And then after knight d4, e d4, d3, you have a position that is 100% identical to a position you could achieve out of the bird opening, with the move order beginning with knight to d4, knight d4, knight d4, e d4, castles, bishop c5, d3. We can get to the exact same spot. And that's even true if they attempt to play something independent, like after bishop b5, let's say they play bishop to c5 and you castle, and they try to play something remotely independent like d6. You can actually achieve similar positions, like for example after c3, bishop d7, d4, and then either bishop b6 or ed4, cd4, bishop b6. You can attain an identical position where white has the same structure except is down one move. You can achieve out of, say, a Italian game move order. So for example, after knight to c6, bishop c4 instead of bishop b5, bishop c5, c3, d6, d4, cd4, ed4. And then bishop b5, bishop d7 is basically the exact same position, but it's, in the Ruy Lopez structure, it's one extra move for white. So if you have this in your repertoire, or if you know anything about this in the Italian game, you'll easily be able to play the position where you have an extra move. So it's, like I said, it's really difficult to find anything independent, but it's important to just kind of cover what everybody's going to be running into. So castles, the most common move you're going to run into is knight to f6, and by far and away the easiest move to prepare, the easiest move to play is going to be knight captures e5. Now, if they play knight takes e5, I think the task for white getting an advantage is relatively easy. This is just the basic fork trick. After knight takes e5, you play d4, and then there's more than one possible move here. It is possible to play both queen e7, and it's possible to play c6. Against either move, white should have some sort of advantage. For example, against queen e7, just take the bishop. The bishop generally is just worth more than the knight, and after queen to c5, just knight c3 should just be slight edge white, without much of a fight. An easy example is Bendarsky versus Palanica in 1971. I probably butchered that last name. Continues castles kingside, and then bishop to e3, queen e7, and then bishop g5 is, of course, advantage white, and white did eventually go on to win. But another way they can play this is they can play, instead of queen e7, they can try c6. It's easy enough just to have this bishop retreat. For example, you can play bishop e2, should be fine. It's also possible to take on e5, and then after knight takes e4, to simply retreat this bishop with bishop to d3. And this is very, very awkward for black to defend as well. He should play d5, and then you should take that pawn en passant. Knight f6 is sort of forced. And then the best move here is knight c3, although in at least one previous game, queen e2 got played. This was a pretty heavy hitter with the white pieces anyway. This was actually Vallejo Pons versus Vichy Anand. But that game did end in a draw, so queen e2 felt a little insufficient there, and probably knight c3 was a little bit stronger. And knight c3 was advantage white, and white eventually did go on to win in Volikin versus Harkek, played back in 2009. So knight c3 is probably the more desirable move. An example would be something like bishop e6, bishop g5. This should just be slight edge white. And white did have an advantage in that game. Just for example, bishop d6, knight e4, takes, knight to c5. This was just slight edge white. So going back, there are these other possibilities. After knight takes e5, of course, they do not have to take back with knight takes e5 and allow the fork trick, which should just be some sort of simple advantage for white. What a lot of people do is they try to cross things up with the move knight takes e4, and for the most part, this should just be considered the main line. And then for the most part, this move queen e2 should just be considered the main line as well. Just queen e2, knight takes e5, queen takes e4, and then queen e7. Now, here's kind of an interesting point in theory and in theoretical preparation in general. For the longest time, it was just kind of respected that there were two moves here, but one of them was thought to be clearly better than the other one. There was knight to c3, and there was d4. And of the two, somehow knight to c3 was thought to be more sophisticated than pawn to d4. And of course, the main reason was on pawn to d4, it was just thought, well, the knight just retreats to c6, and then we just, after queen e7, bishop e7, c3, there's basically nothing in this position for white. Just it's a symmetrical position, and it feels like there's nothing to play for. But the engine sort of just disagrees. The engine just thinks this is advantage white, and white can, of course, try to press from here. And white did press from here. In Ponomarev versus Elyzhinov, white eventually did go on to win. So he had apparently enough of an advantage to press and to play for a win. And it is possible to play for a win from here. So d4 really shouldn't be dismissed as a move, especially considering that in knight c3, it doesn't seem like white's getting a whole lot out of it after knight to g6. Knight to g6, queen e7, bishop to e7. It just doesn't seem like white's getting a ton out of this position. This was played in Anand versus Topalov in France back in 2009, and it ended in a draw after just 17 moves. So white wasn't really getting a whole lot out of this. But you do need to be familiar with kind of the tricks of both. Against knight to c3, black really does need to play knight back to g6. And against pawn to d4, black really does need to play knight to c6. And these little nuances are really critical. Because if you play d4 in this position, which is actually the move I sort of recommend because it's a little bit trappier, if they play knight to g6, white has this amazing tactic at his disposal, which, interestingly enough, Carlsen, when he had this position with the white pieces, he missed it. Magnus Carlsen played queen takes e7 question mark in this position, and he didn't get a whole lot out of the position with the white pieces, and he ended up getting a draw against Wesley So in a game that he played on chess.com back in 2023. He probably just mixed up lines because he was probably expecting Wesley So to play the old main line, which was knight c3, in which case you do respond with knight to g6, because in this position, with the knight on g6, white has this amazing possibility. Pause the video, see if you can find it. White can play the move bishop to d7 check. And this should be major advantage white. Of course, the point being that we can get away with this sort of desperado combination because the bishop on c5 is hanging. You can't take the bishop with the queen. That means that you're either going to have to take that bishop with the king, or you're going to have to take that bishop with the bishop, neither of which works very well. So if, for example, bishop takes, you're going to have queen takes b7, and of course the bishop on c5 is still hanging, and then you would have castles, and then you would have d takes c5, queen c5, knight c3, bishop c6, queen c7 should be major advantage white. This was actually played in Bernatsky versus Ashwath, played back in 2019. So this is actually correct. Bishop b7 check is actually the correct move. And of course, if you don't see the entire justification, of course, if king takes, you would also have queen f5 followed by queen takes c5 as well. So there is no getting out of this tactical nuance of getting your piece back on the c5 square. The sacrifice of bishop d7 is completely sound. So that's sort of the justification behind d4. And of course, just pointing out the alternative move, knight c6, is the correct one, and because of that, knight c3 is another move, but What's interesting to note, if you look at this on a modern engine, the modern engines seem to prefer pawn to d4. They think that pawn to d4 might be better than knight to c3. So anyways, that should cover this particular variation enough, which you're going to run into. So sort of the other two lines that you're going to run into is you're going to run into d6, and you're going to run into knight d4. So I'll go ahead and I'll cover d6 first because it's relatively short. You're just going to play c3, bishop d7, d4, and honestly, on either bishop to b6 or pawn takes pawn, e takes d4, c takes d4, bishop b6, white has a really easy slight advantage. You have the pawn duo in the middle of the board, you have more space, you're castled, you have an extra tempo on a position that you could get out of, like, say, an Evans Gambit or an Italian game or something like that. In the case of the Evans Gambit, you'd be down an additional pawn, and people are more than willing to play these types of positions with white in the Evans Gambit, even down that additional pawn. So it's fairly safe to say that this is something like slight edge white. Now, the one game that I can point to is after d4 and then bishop to b6, I have this game Anashunk versus Monterey, played back in 2010, which continued d takes c5, d takes c5, knight on b to d2, knight on g to e7, knight c4, f6, and then a4. And then after bishop e6, b4, a6, knight b6, cb6, queen d8, rook d8, and then bishop back to e2, was advantage white, and Anashunk did go on to win with the white pieces. And of course, at this point, white's advantage is fairly obvious. He's got the two bishops, black has weaknesses on the b6 square, he has the compromised pawn structure, and he's just not doing all that great. So going back, the other option that people will try after white castles kingside is they'll transpose into a bird defense with knight d4. You should just take, and then e takes d4, you should play d3. So after you play this move order with e takes d4 and d3, what you're going to want to look at is this game Liko versus Mosovich, played in Monte Carlo back in 2004, which of course achieves this position from the bird move order. It didn't achieve it from the classical move order. But that game continued with pawn to c6. We had bishop a4, d6, knight d2, bishop e7, and then a3. Now, I will point out that it's possible for white to achieve a slight edge in simpler ways, even though it doesn't happen a lot at the highest levels, because eventually, at the highest levels, people do understand that eventually they will need to find a retreat for this bishop. The bishop is in danger of getting trapped at some point, so you might as well just create that retreat sooner as opposed to later. And that's what most strong players do. But it is possible to just play f4 a little bit sooner. You can play f4 right now on the spot. That should be advantage white. You can also retreat your bishop, and after even d5, you can still play f4, and that should be advantage white. But the setup will end up being very similar to what happened in this Liko versus Mosovich game. And this is kind of what strong players prefer, is they prefer making sure that their bishop has retreat, and then they worry about playing f4. So they have a5, b4, and of course there's tactical reasons that you can't take twice there, because of course this rook will be hanging to a discovered attack with the threat of bishop to c6 check. So you can retreat is a little bit better, and then we have bishop to b3, we have castles, and then we have bishop b2 targeting that pawn on d4, bishop e6, and now finally f4. And of course we could have achieved this with maybe f4 as a move, as an earlier move order would have been very similar. But after f4, this position should just be considered somewhere between slight edge to major advantage white. In the game continued c5. We had bc5, bishop takes b3, cb3, dc5, a4, f5, knight to c4, bishop to b8, bishop back to c1, bishop c7, bishop d2, queen d7, queen f3, and at least according to the engine, this is major advantage white, and white did go on to win. This was Liko versus Mosovich, played in Monte Carlo back in 2004. So, in summary, when you play bishop b5 and they play bishop to c5, you're basically going to be either transposing into a Berlin with castles kingside, knight to f6. You're going to be transposing into a bird after bishop c5, castles kingside, knight d4 is going to be a bird opening. It's going to directly transpose. Or if they try to play something, I guess you could call it independent after bishop c5 castles, they could try to play something independent with d6. But basically you're just transposing into positions where white's a tempo up in a position that you would normally achieve out of an Italian game. or even an Evans Gambit where you're a tempo up and you haven't sacrificed a pawn, which I think is pretty cool. So anyways, that's how you play against the classical variation with the white pieces. I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you found it useful. I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.